Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I'm going to give folks a few minutes just to connect and settle in. Until then, feel free to grab some water, cup of tea, coffee if it's early. Good morning, Nazanin. You are very welcome. We're very excited to host this. Salamat. I want to say salamat ate, but I think you're too young for ate.
No, I'm very old. I definitely
Oh,
fit the ate for you.
oh really?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
We're for those who don't know Salamat, you can explain,
Oh,
Charlene.
yeah. It's thank you. And my parents are originally from the Philippines. So it's thank you in many of the dialects there. And ate means kind of like older sister, older friend. So yeah.
I think, I think, I think, I think I'm gonna start now. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. All right. Awesome. 10:03. Shall we start, Charlene?
Yes. Yes. Let's
Yeah.
start, Dima.
All right. All right. Great. I'm trying to give folks a few minutes to join,
Oh,
but
sure.
yeah, but it's fine. We can go ahead. Just want to say welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're located. Thank you for joining us today. I invite everyone to put their names, their pronouns, their organizations in the chat. Uh, or maybe if it's a good morning or if it's a good afternoon where you are. Today we're going to be talking about sexual health and mental health for LGBTQI newcomers. Before we begin, as a national organization, Rainbow Coalition for Refuge respectfully recognizes that we live and work on the traditional, unceded territories of many Indigenous nations and First Peoples throughout Canada. I also invite you to acknowledge the land that you're working or living on in the chat. We always strive for respectful partnerships with all the peoples of this country, and we search for collective healing and true reconciliation to honor this beautiful land that I moved onto less than a year ago altogether. um, Rainbow Refugee Society is located on the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. um, Rainbow Coalition for Refuge is now soon to be called From Borders to Belonging. It's a coalition of organizations and people that champion the LGBTQI refugee protection and settlement. And Rainbow Refugee, who is us that we're hosting this webinar today, is the co-chair of the coalition alongside with the Rainbow Railroad. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Dima. My pronouns are they, them. and I am the Time to Thrive project coordinator with Rainbow Refugee. I would also love to introduce my co-facilitator, Sherilyn. I'll let her introduce herself.
Salamat, Tima.
Salamat.
Maayo na aga sa inyong tanan at madamong salamat sa inyong pakidamay. That was my butchered attempt at saying good morning, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. This in the dialects of both my parents, Mas Patino and Sibuyanon, and they're both from the Philippines and came to Turtle Island in the 70s. So I'm very grateful to be joining you all today from the unceded and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I go by she, shea as my pronouns. And I'm very happy to work on two teams at the BC Center for Disease Control. I work with the STBBI team and the harm reduction teams.
Thank you so much, Sherilyn. Before we begin with the actual topic, I just want to go through quickly some community guidelines that we can all share on this platform today. I invite you to be open to learning and acknowledge that everyone has different experiences, different backgrounds. Some of the things that we say here today might be things that you're already know a lot of, or it might be new to you. So I would like to invite you to be open to these facts. And secondly, we are going to be possibly challenging current knowledge. I might mention a few things that challenge what is known to you. If this information aligns with you, please take it, digest it, make it your own, and see how you can honor it. This is all based on experiences from Rainbow Refugee and the BC CDC and their work with LGBTQI newcomers. I always look forward finding ways to integrate new information that I learn, and I invite you to do the same as well. If the things that we're going to talk about today might not align with you, in that case, I urge you to lean into the discomfort and try to approach this information with some curiosity. Um, Me and Sherilyn are working with you, and it's never going to be against you. We always work in solidarity, striving for the best we can be. Questions in the chat. If you have any additions or thoughts, or if you would like to talk, please just raise your hand, and we'll be sure to have that conversations. And last but not least, we treat everyone with respect and participate while acknowledging that everyone deserves to be here and everyone has their own journey of learning. Uh, After, yeah, I think we've done introductions. I'm going to take you through the journey of this presentation. We're going to try to make it as engaging as possible since we don't have a huge number of attendees. We don't want to be just talking for 90 minutes. We're going to start after this slide with a simple poll just to gauge everyone's knowledge and experience levels at this point. After that, we're going to define who are the folks we're talking about, who are the LGBT newcomers, and what are the unique and particular challenges that come with that from a sexual health and from a mental health point of view. From there, we're going to introduce the intersectionality of these two things, discuss some of the complexities, some of the unique qualities this intersection holds, and Sherilyn will take it from there and walk you through a few case studies that we're happy to share with you. We're gonna take a break in between all these information, probably after learning and unlearning. So Adam is online here with us, and he's the Nationals Project Manager, and he's gonna be assisting in starting this poll. Uh, so yeah, if you can just quickly um, see what category you fall under, will be very helpful for us just to understand where everyone's at right now. Thank you. I think we have almost all the answers. All right. Um, Thank you so much for answering this. This is very helpful. I'm just taking a look right now. It seems like we're also in a very queer space. So that's always a space that's good to be in. Um, oh, okay. Um, so I want to take a moment to define a little bit the community that we're working with. Um, okay, I'm having some technical issues. My apologies. I want to take a little bit to define the community that we're working with. Who are the LGBTQI newcomers? Uh, I will also encourage you to think about why would someone leave their own country and what might be the circumstances that led to this decision. We want to touch on the fact that there are different refugee pathways. Some come with different, each of them come with different administration access. For example, refugees who land with a PR status, they're immediately covered and have federal health coverage, which is called IFHP. IFHP is the Interim Federal Health Program, which is a medical insurance program for some newcomers. And we can talk a little bit more about that if someone wants to ask a little bit. Any service provider can sign up. And for example, the other way of being a refugee is to be a refugee claimant, and that person might spend weeks and months inside the country with no access to any medical insurance. Um, and building on what I just said, forcibly displaced refugees can also include those with the precarious status, who is basically a migrant that is born in a country other than his country of residence and whose immigration status in that country is not guaranteed. For example, like me, I was born in Syria. I lived, I was a resident of the United Arab Emirates because my family couldn't go back to Syria due to war. So I was confined to that space. And then from there, I was sponsored to enter Canada as an LGBTQI refugee. It's always important to respect everyone's right and their humanity as well, as we act as service providers for them. And in this presentation, we're mostly talking about those who have experienced the forced displacement factor and not, for example, an American international student who came to Canada to get gender affirming care, for example. So that's not the population we're talking about. Um, it's important also that we ground our work historically, recognizing that discrimination against LGBTQI people can be traced back to colonization. And if you met a person of color from a developing country, we want to try to not blame their culture and not blame the bad experiences that they had there, and recognize the role of the US and North American politics that have played uh, and have played into creating these conditions where people have to leave and flee their countries. Um, we always try to look at people from a position of empowerment. And if you think about it, all cultures can be homophobic and stigmatizing. So there's no single country or nation that is not like that, or there is no people who do that. Uh, which leads to we also need to recognize that there's a lot of this happening also within Canada. And I'm going to take a break here. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts about what I just said, even Sherilyn.
I'm just really glad you said that, Dima, because later on I'll be talking a little bit about public health. And public health is, it's healthcare that is kind of interested in protecting the health of everyone. But public health also has its own history of racism in this country and other countries, and we haven't always done a really good job of supporting people. I mean, even that continues even now. We can talk about some examples. that's related to sexual health. For instance, that now if you have a BC Care card, if you're a resident of BC, you can access free contraception. But that's not really the case if you're a newcomer and if you don't have coverage. So there's a lot of things that are not equal and that do stem from colonization and racism in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And these issues are very, very real, and they often go unnoticed unless a person with lived experience comes forth and talks about them. We also um, want to ground our work with the intersectionality. We're working with different countries across the globe here in Canada. This country has a big refugee population, and we have noticed a big divide in the settlement organizations and LGBTQI support. What usually ends up happening is that an LGBTQI refugee is too queer or too LGBTQI for settlement organizations, and the LGBTQI circles are unable to or don't know how to support a refugee. And as a result of that, there's a lot of harmful practices, some gender discrimination, especially in the settlement field, and a lot of xenophobia and white supremacy in the LGBTQI field and circles. So we want to see how we can cater to the sexual health and mental health people, but also want to recognize the mental struggles that they go through before reaching to any service provider. Um, Inclusion and diversity. We want to ground people in inclusion and diversity. It's important for us to become more inclusive. We need to be, in general, all of us more educated about diversity. And I encourage everyone here to look at your communities and look at your workplace and assess who is there and who isn't, and ask yourself, why is this person not present? Approaching it with curiosity and understand there's usually a systematic reason why this person is not present in these circles, and the same thing towards the population that you're serving as a service provider. Notice who is there, notice who isn't, and ask yourself, why are these people unable to access these services? If anyone has any experience or anecdote they'd like to share about their work, now is the time. And there's some space in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can have a little conversation about it. I usually allow a few moments of awkward silence. Sometimes that helps people. So if you're feeling awkward, that's okay. All right. On to the next one. We're going to talk a little bit about the unique challenges of the LGBTQI refugee communities. And I have both personal and professional experience with this, as a lot of these incidents come from very well-intentioned service providers or circles. Um, this tells me that there's blind spots that I want you to reflect on and pay attention to when, pay attention to these blind spots when you're interacting with an LGBTQI refugee. For example, comments like, "Oh, you're so lucky to be here," is something that I heard a lot and is said a lot. And if you think this is something is okay to say, this is a perfectly safe space for us to acknowledge and learn more about what the statement is and the complexities behind it. Another example is, it's good that you're here now. So when we're providing a service and the person tells us, "Oh, I couldn't access this service back home," and the reaction is, "Oh, it's good to be here. It's good that you're here now." These things can come off as patronizing because you don't know what the person's experience was like back home. It might be way better than this. It might be way worse. We don't know. And secondly, you don't know what it's like for them to be here as well. So there's a lot of things that we don't know, and life and experiences are complex. Being in Canada is complex. Being home is complex, and there might have been multiple living spots until this person reached Canada, or sometimes Canada isn't even the final destination. This person is transiting here. So it's important to not assume based on stereotypes and understand that LGBTQI refugees suffer a big loss of community once they immigrate. Uh, a lot of LGBTQI refugees will build their own safe circles in unsafe conditions, and once they migrate, although that might be something that is really something that they really want, but it's a big loss. And yes, there's legal protection here, but that doesn't mean actual physical and mental safety for everyone. These kind of comments create like an us and them narrative, and instead of approaching things with curiosity. um, I want to talk a little bit about some of the unique challenges surrounding sexualized violence. And Sherlyn, I don't know if you would like to say a few words here, or if you have them at the end of presentation.
I'm thank you for bringing it up. I will bring up some examples related to this later on.
Okay, yeah, that can do. So we'll talk a lot about sexualized violence and how LGBTQI refugees face disproportionate amounts of sexualized violence in all its forms due to instability, impressionability, or the sense of being lost. LGBTQI refugees might find themselves in sexually abusive situations. Another complication is the lack of education about where they can seek support and how. And we hope to provide some knowledge about this further into the workshop. Thank you in advance, Sherilyn, for that. Um, Another unique challenge for LGBTQ refugee, and that affects their mental health tremendously, is accessing healthcare. So depending on how you get to Canada and what your status is in Canada, you have different types or tiers of access to healthcare. That also depends on the province. In BC, for example, until you have all your documents and the SIN number, you can't apply for MSP, which is the Provincial Health Service Insurance. And unless you pay taxes, you don't have medication coverage. And a lot of newcomers can't do any of these two things. But for example, if you're sponsored refugee and you're landing, you're automatically enrolled in the IFHP that we mentioned earlier. And I highly encourage you to do your own research about what is the equivalent of IFHP. No, I think IFHP captures all provinces. Yes, it does. Just do your own research about who is an IFHP service provider, and if you are one, and if you're not, why not? Uh, because it's like very simple and easy to sign up for, and who can help you sign up for it. Personally speaking, like IFHP is not like a magic solution. IFHP has been quite challenging to navigate. I'm fluent in English. I've always dealt with service providers in English my whole life, and navigating IFHP has been quite impossible at times. So that takes that makes me think that it is our job as service providers to understand the system, understand the barriers, and support people navigating the system. A lot of people come and think that there's universal healthcare in Canada, and it's for anyone and everyone at any time, and that's just simply not true. And this affects their mental health, and people will take it personally and say, oh, why is this happening to me, and this is but just me, like everyone else has it, but it's just it's always my luck. So they will start beating themselves up, and the mental health will really suffer, and they will feel that all the odds are against them. And I must admit, when I first landed, like a month or two, when I was seeking gender affirming care, I felt like all the odds are against me. Like, okay, I migrated and I'm still facing those systematic challenges. So what we can do is just tell them, as a service provider, we can tell them that we're going to use all the systematic power that we have to support them and walk them through it, and empower them in the way. So we don't have to do it on their behalf, but we want to empower them to advocate for themselves, essentially. Um, There's also I'm not sure if you in your line of work you deal with face to face like complaints, or you hear people or you read emails, but a lot of people send very long emails to Rainbow Refugee with their stories. And when we are faced with something like that and we actually read the email and listen carefully to what the person is saying, you will find that the person will tell you exactly what the problem is and what the solution is and what they need. So it's very easy to capture as a service provider simply by listening. um, where do we start? So everything sucks, and that was a very negative presentation so far. So what do we do? How do we attack something like kind of like a beast like this? So things like this right now, attending trainings and education and understanding why these things are important topics, and connecting with other like-minded peers who are also wondering the same and wanting to learn about the same. We also encourage you to expand the personal and professional communities. We all grow up in different systematically oppressed environments, and we usually gravitate towards working with the people we relate most to. And if you live in, if your current service community is already involving LGBTQI newcomers, then that's great. And if not, you might be a little bit uncomfortable working with the LGBTQI refugee community. And that's totally okay. We just encourage you to examine those feelings, sit with them, recognize who's absent, recognize your friends and your community, and some of the reasons that you might not have like a colleague like that is XYZ. um, of course, we're not just telling you go and make friends, but we're just trying to say that to examine the situation that you're in from a community and from a service provider point of view. So back to like critical thinking, and once we start questioning why systems work the way they do and not just accepting it as they are, uh, this is when a little bit of change might happen. Um, Remember that we also want to diversify and ground our work, and there's a lot of messiness that comes with it. And my my boss said something in the last presentation, and she said that you want to welcome the messiness that comes with all of that, and just with an open heart, like, yeah, it's gonna be messy, but we're gonna learn a lot, and it's gonna be great. Um, does anyone want to add anything? Any thoughts? Yeah, Bopo.
Yep. Hi, I'm Bobo. Thank you for the presentation. It's very good to know more about the work that Rainbow Refugee does. I just have a question because right now I know some, settlement agents, they also provide services for LGBTQI, but I would like to know, like, is there any intake procedures or how do you reach those, like service users from the Rainbow Refugee platform? Because I think um, I truly believe Rainbow Refugees values, the decolonization and the value that which make the difference between the mainstream settlement agent services, right? Who receive really, big funding from the federal government. So I would like to know more about, like, is there like any criteria? Because even, for example, from my personal experience, even if I want to join some settlement agents services, if I'm not a PR, I can't actually access to any, even webinar information. Thank you
Mm-hmm.
so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Bopo. It's a very good question. First of all, I want to thank you for trusting Rainbow Refugee and thinking that we're able to do such work. That's great to know. And in regards to your question, the first thing that Rainbow Refugee does is to intake the person and to assess what the person needs and how we can help them systematically. And that is so like they're so specific. It depends on so many factors. So if you're wanting to reach out and learn more, I'm gonna leave an email in the chat. I can open the chat.
I can also answer that, Dima. Do you want me to
Yes,
answer
please,
that?
Nazanin, go ahead.
Hi, Papa. This is Nazan, and my camera is broken right now, so my camera is off. I apologize. My name is Nazan, and I am the Time to Thrive program manager. For anyone who wants to get in touch with us to see if it's appropriate to refer someone to us or to connect someone who can get support from us, the best email is support@rainbowrefugee.ca, and Dima is going to put that in the chat. And if you are a service provider and if you want to also get involved in learning about how to best support refugee claimants, there is a multi-agency program that is going on that are from any services that support refugee claimants. Not just settlement, not just queer services, like we have Van City and IRCC also joining those meetings. It's called MAP BC. And if you do have refugee claimants in the folks that you're supporting, in the population that you're supporting, you can also join them. So email support@Rainbow Refugee, and we can chat more. And I can Larry is the person who's monitoring that email, is our support coordinator, and Larry and I can answer all your questions. Thank you. Sorry, Dima, I jumped in like that I can just like respond to this.
No, that's great. That's great. Thank you so much for doing that. Yeah. And I honestly, I want to take this opportunity to read some of the comments in the chat that I was actually asking people to participate in the chat and I didn't have the notifications. So Horst said that beyond active and more visible prejudice, I think it's also important to acknowledge that ignoring the unique personal circumstances of LGBTQI and radicalized newcomer refugees is also harmful. Everyone deserves to be treated as a unique individual. Not doing so is often the consequence of either ignorance or racism and homophobia, transphobia, or biphobia, or some combinations of those. And that's spot on, Horst. Thank you for sharing that. I really encourage anyone who has any thoughts to just dump them in the chat. We love to go through these things and read them together. It's always there's something new in them. Always. Um back to the learning and unlearning, unless someone else has another question. I forgot to leave awkward silence this time. If anyone else has a question, please raise your hand or leave it in the chat. Promise I'm paying attention in the chat. Racialized. Yes. Okay. So if you notice during the presentation so far, I very intentionally did not include any identities. This is also something I learned newly, and it's because identities are ever changing and ever developing. What was authentic 10 years ago might not be today. It's important to identify these terms, but it's also important to not get hung up on them. And if you have the right attitude and use the wrong pronoun or the wrong identifying information for someone, and if you had made yourself safe enough and built that connection with the client, then they will correct you. If you do harm someone unintentionally, when you build a connection with them, you can mend it and you can mitigate the harm. So I would encourage us all to do some personal work. And if we make a mistake, I'm guilty of doing this sometimes, not to make it about you and how sorry and how great you are as a person and you would never do something like that. But these are your feelings and you need to sit with it, apologize, move on, because it's not the other person's job to make us feel better about our mistake. Another part of learning is also understanding different realities from different perspectives. And sometimes that could be something as simple as watching a movie that is not American or North American, just exposing yourself to those cultures and using those as an information resource instead of tokenizing a person and using the person as an information resource. So if you're curious about If you're a service provider and you're just curious about someone, it's probably not your place to ask them for more information that is not relevant to the service that you're actually providing. We don't want to exotify the person and make it a sort of like inspiration or statements like, oh, you're so strong, you're such an inspiration. Those statements usually land in a, not usually, but sometimes they can land in a patronizing way because a lot of us refugees, we didn't choose to be brave or resilient. Um, this was the way, and there was no other way because there was other consequences to be faced. So we had no choice in being strong and resilient. And just hearing that might remind people of the lack of choices that they had in their lives. Um, so those are some of the things that we can learn. I want to talk about a little bit about things like we need to unlearn a lot of myths about people in general and assumptions about refugees being helpless or that they're going to have a great life in Canada. Um, a lot of myths about certain accents and certain languages, respecting and understanding that everyone has a language. And if someone speaks more languages than you, we need to acknowledge and respect that. Um, there's also a lot of myths around sexual health and sexualized violence. There's a lot of stigmas that circulate in the around and in the LGBTQI refugee community, and we're going to examine how that intersects with the person's sexual and mental health status. And Sherlin's going to take us through some examples in a bit. I'm trying to do a little bit of focus on the mental health aspect first, and then we're going to see how these two kind of collide. There's a lot of values to unlearn, and this part is definitely like personal work. For example, I didn't know about colonization in Canada or colonization in my own country, and I had to unlearn a lot of these ideologies myself. There's also a lot of unsafe organizations out there, and so we want to make sure that we don't refer clients or members to organizations or service providers that we know for a fact are unsafe, whether it's from a discriminatory or from a homophobic or a biphobic point of view, and always leaving the choice to the people. If you must refer them to a service provider that you have experienced or known that they're unsafe, possibly tell the client and trust that they will have agency to make the best decision for themselves, but always relay that information. Um, we're gonna take a bit of a brain break. I'm thinking 10 minutes. Um, and then we can regroup and come back. Is everyone okay with that? Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Prax, Chantel. Oh, hey, Sophia's here. Okay, 10 minutes break, everyone. See you in 10. Hello, everyone. Gonna be back in two. The soft, gentle reminder so that we're still here. What did you, Sherman? Did you go and grab some water?
I did. I just had a bit of juice and I had to grab a blanket because I'm so cold.
Oh,
It's cold in this.
it's it's still raining here. I'm missing the sun.
Yeah, I know. Because I do wonder about like the cherry blossoms. Like some of them are blooming, but then some of them are not. And I think it's because it's like sunny, but then it's cold again.
It's a bit unstable.
Yeah,
Yeah, the cherry blossoms are thinking about it.
yeah,
There's no cooperation.
yeah. I think it's so nice to have
Um,
a brain break, actually. It's like good to just get up and, you
yeah,
know, it's a
shake it
really good
out.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't do well if there's like just like one go.
Yeah, I should remember that because I think I often just do presentations. I'm just like talking for like an hour, but it's just good to get up and use the bathroom, all the stuff you have to do.
Heather did a little
Oh,
backstretch.
backstretch.
Yeah,
That's good. Yeah.
I love it. That's great. So I hope everyone had a good brain break and did what they needed to do to take care of themselves. Oh, sorry, my voice is probably low. Here we go. Um, we're gonna move on to a little bit to the like second part of this webinar, which is I'm gonna warm up to by asking the question of how do we understand the true meaning behind certain words? When we say culture, something is culturally safe, when we say something is stigma free, when we say something is trauma informed, when we say it's accessible, what is the true meaning of these words? Because I feel like they've reached to a stage where they're like buzzwords, but nobody truly kind of knows what they mean. So I invite anyone to write in the chat or raise their hand and maybe help us define a few of these terms together if you feel like it. I know it's early, or I'm not sure if you're in BC or no, but it's just something to think about. So, what is it? What does it mean to be culturally safe for you as a service provider?
For me, I would just say it's something that I'm always trying to work at. Something about what you have on the slide here is that all of these, none of them are kind of states that you arrive at and then you just are. It's something that is daily, moment to moment sometimes, especially at work, and something that's an ongoing process to continue to achieve so that hopefully um, you can become an ally where someone feels that you are culturally safe to be around and that you are someone that tries to reduce stigma. Because certainly it's not something that we can just say, oh, I do that. I am culturally safe at work. It's not something you can ever really claim. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, I couldn't have put it in better words myself. Like it's a pursuit, right? It's not necessarily a goal because things are ever changing, and so we're constantly evolving and trying to navigate how we can be more culturally safe or just better. Nazanin is saying culturally safe is culturally accessible, whether it's images, visual, languages. Cultural humility is to believe our culture is not the best and also appropriate and accessible. Alexander said it's constantly changing, evolving, and being inclusive. Exactly, I love that. Bopo said cultural safety is about individuals who has trust with staff, who is culturally sensitive and willing to share the concern under this safe environment. These are all great and shows me that a lot of people have in this space at least have a good understanding of what culturally safe practices are. So culturally safe is an outcome that is based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address the power imbalances that are inherent in our healthcare systems. Um, when you're culturally safe, it results in an environment that is free of racism and discrimination, and where people feel safe when receiving, for this example, healthcare or sexual healthcare. An example for that is when you walk into a space and if there's like posters of nude bodies everywhere, ask yourself, am I, as a service provider, being a culturally safe zone? Is this something that everyone or anyone wants to be exposed to? Those are like, this is just a simple example. And what does it mean to be stigma free? I think, Sherlyn, maybe you have a lot of experience when it comes to stigma and stigma. Yeah. So please share with us if you'd like.
Yeah, so stigma, I mean, you've done such a good job already talking about this, Dima, but stigma, um, it's it's kind of this act of discriminating a person or a group of people based on like characteristics that they might have, or when it comes to sexual health, based on maybe an infection that they have or are living with. And um, it's it's obviously tied again to some of the concepts that you've already introduced, which is racism and colonization and inequity. Um, and so I think part of being stigma free, one of the attempts that we can make is to be really careful with our language. Just as someone myself who's worked in sexual health and worked in harm reduction, we used to use terms, we used to really refer to people in a disrespectful way. We used to say, oh, people who are high risk, or
Mhm.
people who uh, are injection drug users, because referring to people that way, it's like that's all they are. And but we all know that people are more, many faceted things. And so some of the language that we use now are people who inject their drugs or people who engage in drugs, and people aren't high risk. Some people belong to maybe groups or communities that we should be prioritizing more, because really the term high risk comes from the fact that we've set up barriers for certain people, and we haven't really done the work as a society to try to eliminate those barriers. And so it kind of takes the blame away from the individual and puts it back where it should be, which is on society and on people with privilege and service providers.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's almost like we're making, excuse me, we're making a commitment to create a safe, welcoming environment based on the principles you just said, like being tolerant, being accepting, not making the person fear to be ridiculed or harassed or bullied for something that they are, which is not their entire personality. It's just a fragment of themselves. And that brings us to like the trauma informed and violence informed care, describing like a framework of working with and relating to people who have experienced negative consequences um, by exposing themselves to a service provider who's using practices that are not violent informed. Like this, we see this a lot in the community, and we're gonna touch on, I'm sure, a little bit within the case studies. And we have Alexander here sharing something quite nice. They said, I like the acronym PIE, public, intentional, and explicit, which is like such a good uh, reminder or like a rule of thumb to be around, and how we can strive to do more of that. Um, Brings us last part is the accessible content, and accessibility doesn't just mean the physical accessibility of a place, but it means systematic accessibility, like not just language barriers but also jargon barriers, and systematically new things that a lot of the LGBTQI refugee population are not familiar with simply. And I'm going to hand it back to you, Sherilyn, if you can share your screen and introduce us to some parts of sexual health safety.
Thank you, Dima. And I just want to thank you also um, for doing such a wonderful job of talking about these topics that are, like you said, have kind of become buzzwords in a way, but I feel like you've done it in a very like intentional and honorable way, in a way that's very approachable. And because it's hard to talk about some of these things and sometimes hard to really incorporate them into our thoughts and into the work that we do. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Very grateful, because this is for everyone, this is my first time presenting with Dima. And also thank you for all your comments. I feel like I'm very happy to be in all of your company. So I'm just gonna show my presentation here. And okay, so you can just see my slides, is that right? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
My part of the presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual health services, and in particular, how refugee and newcomer communities can access sexual health services. I'll touch a bit on supporting accessibility to services. We'll also talk about when you are accessing sexual health care, what information is shared and what is not shared. And also, we'll talk about some tips for service providers, kind of based on what Dima was just talking about in terms of reducing stigma, trying to be more culturally safe, trying to be more inclusive. And again, I won't be talking about these topics really in this order. And I want to thank Dima and Heather, who's on the call, for bringing up a really good way to do this, which is through case studies, or really it's stories, stories about people that we've worked with. And obviously, I'm not using people's real names or even like actual individual stories, but it's more like a mishmash, an amalgamation of different people that I've worked with and learned from over my work as a nurse and nurse educator working in harm reduction and STBBIs. So I want you to meet Max. So again, Max's story doesn't belong to any one person in particular, but it's a story that I hope reflects some of the experiences of many LGBTQI plus refugee newcomers. So Max is 29 years old. Max is a cis man. His gender identity matches kind of his sex assigned at birth. So he's a cis man. Max goes by the pronouns he, him, and is a newcomer to Canada. So Max identifies as a gay man and was many years witness to violence and persecution of friends and loved ones from the gay community in his home country. So after being the target of violence himself, he fled his country and applied to be a refugee claimant after arriving in Canada. So after quite a lot of paperwork, which I'm sure many people on the call are probably familiar with, so quite a lot of paperwork, appointments, and an interview, his application was reviewed and deemed eligible to be referred to the IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. So now Max still has many months and maybe even years ahead of him before he gets a hearing to determine whether he will be granted protected person status, because through that status, that could enable him to apply for permanent residency. But until then, because his application has been deemed eligible and has been referred to IRB, he now has coverage under the Interim Federal Health Program, which Dean has talked about already, the IFHP, Interim Federal Health Program. Okay. And so Max is seeking care because he had sex without a condom with a person he met at a friend's party. So what are the different options for Max to get sexual health care, including getting tested for STBBIs? So first, let's do a quick check on what we mean by STBBIs, as this is a term that might be new to some folks. So STBBIs stands for sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections. So these are infections that can be passed on from having sex, and some that can also be carried in the blood. So these include the infections on the following list: chlamydia, gonorrhea, and these two are among the most common STIs. And then we have trichomoniasis, syphilis, genital warts, herpes, HIV, and hepatitis. So STBBIs can be passed on in a number of different ways. So it can be passed on during sex when you have contact with genital fluids and rectal fluids. And some are even passed on through skin-to-skin contact, like syphilis, genital warts, and herpes. And then there are ones that are carried in the blood and that can be passed on from either blood transfusion or from sharing needles and injection equipment when taking drugs. And these STBBIs include HIV and hepatitis B and C. And just one thing to note, in Canada, just like in many other countries, if for blood transfusion, that blood is screened prior uh, for it being given to another person to make sure that it doesn't have some of these infections. And so some STBBIs can also be passed on either during pregnancy or giving birth, or when a parent is providing milk to the infant by breastfeeding or chest feeding. And this includes the infection syphilis, herpes, HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C. However, most of these infections can be prevented by using condoms, and in some situations, even by taking medication. And all of these infections are treatable, and many of them can actually be cured. And so, also, when we're talking about sexual health is basically about being aware of your body and mind. It's actually very fundamental to the overall health and well-being of individuals, couples, relationships, families, and the social and healthy development of communities and countries. And sexual health is about positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free from coercion, free from discrimination, and free from violence. So, what would be involved then for Max if Max wanted to go get tested for STBBIs? So, this is a bit of a snapshot of what a person can expect. So, for all of you folks who are service providers, this is something that you can share with clients who are maybe accessing the service here for the first time. So, in person at a clinic, they would be offered privacy and confidentiality in a private room. The healthcare provider will ask about their main concerns regarding STBBIs. And in order to determine the need for additional tests or exams, they will ask about sexual history and practices. But I want to note that it is up to you, the client, about what questions you want to answer and what information you want to provide. And this is something that maybe as healthcare providers working in STBBI care or sexual health, that we could possibly do more often. We can maybe tell people before we start asking all these questions that it's still up to them. It's not going to be kind of a mandatory process in order for them to get the care that they need, but it does provide some additional information to the healthcare provider. But again, it's not mandatory. And I feel that for everyone, including newcomers, that it's something that we can kind of say at the beginning, because otherwise people are sitting there and you're asking them questions that maybe they're not comfortable with, but then they feel that they have to. And people should have choice in every aspect of their healthcare visit. And it's also up to you to, as the client, to agree to some or all parts of the physical exam or none of it. So just so you know, when people are coming in for sexual health screening or STBBI testing, it's not always necessary to do a physical exam. If someone is having symptoms, the healthcare provider can offer this, but again, it is totally up to the client. And this can include a visual assessment of looking inside the throat, looking at the skin on the back and the abdomen, looking at the outside of the genitals and the anus, and sometimes using gloved hands as the healthcare provider to press gently on the testicles between the gloved hands, or using again gloved hands to gently move apart the labia, which is the folds of the vulva, with gloved hands, or using a speculum, which is basically a plastic tool that we use. The person would be lying down, face up, legs apart, and the healthcare provider, again with gloved hands and using the speculum, would use it to view the inside of the vagina and to view the cervix. But again, none of this is mandatory. It's something that provides helpful information to the healthcare provider. But again, the testing can still be done in some ways without having to do all parts of this exam. And just so folks know, for an STBBI screening visit, no one ever has to be like completely naked the whole time. The respectful way to do it and the way that kind of we're taught to do it is that people only need to remove clothing that is needed for that particular part of the exam. So if I'm looking at, say, the back or the abdomen, I just need to ask someone to like lift up their shirt or their sweater. I don't need to have them totally remove their top. And if they need a speculum exam, then it's really just removing kind of the bottom undergarments, but your upper garments should still be on. And also there is testing that can be included, which includes taking, it's almost like a swab, like a Q-tip kind of style swab that we use to take a sample from either inside the throat, inside the rectum, the vagina, the cervix, and blood tests. And the blood tests can be done sometimes in that same visit, right, in that room, or often it's done where the person takes a form to a separate lab and gets it done there. So after 1 week, Max's test results come back, and it showed that he had gonorrhea in his urethra. So the urethra is the opening to the penis. But all of the other test results were negative. So it showed that Max does not have chlamydia, syphilis, Hep C, or HIV. But I have a few questions for all of you based on Max's experience so far as a newcomer, who is a refugee claimant in Canada. Where did Max go to get tested? Did Max have to pay for the tests? How will he get access to medication to treat the gonorrhea? And what other STBBI services might Max be able to access and how? So I'll let you just kind of ponder on those questions. I know that some of you might know the answers already, but if you don't yet, just think about that. So as an overview, to look at the services that are available to support the sexual well-being of refugee and newcomer communities, it can be quite broad. But it can also depend on the government insurance coverage that exists for a person. So, for instance, some sexual health services include what I just talked about, which is screening or testing for STBBIs, and then also treatment. So technically, these two components are technically free, but I'm going to say technically. So the medications, you don't have to pay for these medications, and the tests themselves, you don't have to pay for, but it's the steps before that that can actually cost someone money. And it again depends on the coverage. So for instance, in order to get the assessment, in order to be seen by a healthcare provider to do the assessment, to do the exam, you have to register at that clinic. And as we know, for a lot of folks, if you don't have health coverage, if you don't have the interim federal health program, if you don't have a care card, then you might have to pay for actually being seen in the first place. And the same goes with the labs. If you don't have coverage, then you might have to pay at the lab before they will actually take the samples. And so, for example, Max does have IFHEP coverage because he went through the process to become a refugee claimant. A person with interim federal health program coverage can access STBBI testing at many places, like a walk-in clinic, at a primary care clinic if they have their own doctor or nurse practitioner, and in some areas in BC and possibly in other areas in other provinces, at a local public health unit. So in Max's case, with IFHP coverage, he did not have to pay for testing or the medication to cure gonorrhea. But what about newcomers who don't have IFHP coverage? Well, there can definitely be some barriers. And again, it's those upfront costs that many people cannot afford. So in that case, there is another option. It's an option in BC. Unfortunately, I know we have some folks calling from other provinces right now, and I'm not sure what's available there. But here in BC, we have a website called Get Checked Online. You do not need ID. You do not need a care card. You can sign up online. You'll get an assessment done, and then you'll get a code, and you can take that code with you to the lab. But the barrier again here is that the website is in English. So it would require possibly you as a service provider to assist someone in how to navigate that website. And I'll share that website later on. I have a slide of resources. And so for those of us who don't have coverage, but we need access to STBBI testing, another option is going to the BC CDC West 12th Clinic. But again, this is only for people who can physically travel to this clinic, which is located in Vancouver. So it's obviously not an option for people who don't live within travel distance of this clinic. But at this clinic, you also do not need ID, and they offer anonymous testing, meaning testing that is done with a completely fake name, if you wish. So other sexual health services that are available are medications called post-exposure medication for HIV or hepatitis B. So these are medications that can actually, in many cases, prevent HIV infection or hepatitis B infection soon after a person is exposed, let's say through sex. But again, while these medications are free, they can often only be accessed at certain places, like at an emergency room. And so again, that would still require someone showing their care card or their IFHP at the point of registration. Other services that are also available, but again, truly only free for those with IFHP coverage include contraception prescriptions, so prescriptions for medications that can prevent pregnancy, pregnancy care, abortion care, cancer screening, so screening for the cervix, mammogram tests, screening for prostate cancer, and also gender affirming care. So these are all services, again, covered for those with IFHP coverage. And earlier, when I mentioned that STBBIs can be prevented by using condoms, and some can even be prevented by taking medication, I was talking about HIV. So it's called PrEP. PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis, and what that means is that taking this medication can prevent HIV from being passed on during sex or when sharing drug equipment. And this is something that would be offered to Max because it's offered to people who are cis men, or trans women who are HIV negative and who are having sex with other men and may also have a higher chance of getting HIV. Are there any questions so far? I see here Heather added a note. There's other public health clinics in BC that offer the services free without coverage. That's right. And so in addition to the Get Checked Health Online and BCCDC. So there's other options for free services. And it would, throughout the province, so it would probably be connecting maybe with some local service providers to find out where they are.
Yeah, I'd say many public health clinics across the province actually offer services to people without MSP. I'll add just a link here for Smart Sex Resource for those in BC, where you can filter for BC Medical Services Plan card not required and filter for services there.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, Smart Sex Resource is actually one I was going to talk about, but I'm glad you talked about it now. So it is an online website. And again, it does, thank you for reminding me, it does have a clinic finder on there. And so you can look up some of these services for if you are in BC.
That's great. And I also want to encourage people, if they know of any similar or better or accessible resources in other provinces, please do share in the chat, because another reason why we have these calls is for knowledge exchange as well. So if you know of any resources, please do share in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I have a few more questions about Max's journey accessing sexual health services. So who else will know about Max's gonorrhea result? Will the IRB know, so the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada? Will it have an impact on his ongoing refugee claim? So all really important questions. Well, in Canada, it's important to know that some infections are considered reportable to public health. So when it comes to STBBIs, it's not all of them that are reportable to public health, it's some of them. So that would include chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, HIV, and all of the hepatitis A, B, and C. So what ends up happening is anytime anyone goes for STBBI testing, once all of the results are processed and finalized, they will get sent back to the clinic where the test was done. And then that clinic will inform the client that the results are ready and what the results are. But if the lab processes a positive result, it will also be sent to the local public health unit. This is a public health unit that is specific to the area that the testing was done in. And again, I'm talking about the BC context. It's possible that this is different in some of the other provinces. The point of this is actually, it's not to shame or punish people. It's really a way to offer additional support to that person. And it's also a way to monitor the trends of infections over the long term and to help public health plan programs and services. So for example, it's not just STBBIs that are reportable. For example, tuberculosis is also an infection that is reportable to public health. And so when someone has tuberculosis, public health would also in that case be contacted to see if that person needs support, to check in if they need help taking their medications, and to make sure that they continue to stay healthy. So this is a process that is in place for many kind of communicable diseases or infections that can be passed on from person to person. It's important to note that this information is never reported to the police or employers. This is health information that is very confidential. It remains with the person who got tested, the clinic they got tested at, and public health. So in answer to the questions about who else would know about Max's positive gonorrhea result, which is a reportable infection in Canada, it's very likely that it just stays with the healthcare provider and public health if there is a positive result. Will the IRB know? So the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. So I should state that I'm not an immigration lawyer, but based on what I have found online and also based on my own experience of working in public health for many years, the answer is very likely no. And therefore it will not affect his refugee claim. And that's because the goal of making an infection reportable is really, again, to protect the health of that person and also to protect public health. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, all the STBBIs are treatable and many of them can actually be cured. So with an infection like gonorrhea or even chlamydia or syphilis, these are infections that can be completely cured with medication. So once Max was treated for his positive gonorrhea result, he was essentially cured. And so there would be no further need for public health to let anyone else know. So, and definitely not the IRB. So it's really about ensuring that the person gets the support and care that they need. And it's also why there's never a reason to tell the police or an employer. So, yeah.
Sherlyn, there's Nazanin has her hand. I'm gonna ask Nazanin to unmute as she
Oh,
has
sure.
also lots of experience when it comes to complications like these or complexity.
Thank you. Thank you for the information. This is very educational for me. What I want to add is for folks who might not access CDC. So this is the CDC is, like as Sharon said, it's very much bound and very committed to confidentiality. And I just want to also remind folks that a refugee claimant, based on where in their process they're required to do a medical exam, the immigration medical exam. Sharon, are you going to be talking about that?
I was going to talk a little bit about that. Yes.
Great. Okay, great. Because
then,
that might actually have some implication, but not from BCCDC.
Correct. That's very correct. Thank you, Nazanin. Yes. So I'll talk a little bit about that because it does depend on who did your test. So for Max, right, he did it not part of his immigration medical exam. He did it because he had a concern and he kind of went to a clinic and did the testing there. And so because of that, that information really kind of does stay in the realm of public health, but it is a little bit different if your testing was done as part of your immigration medical exam. So this actually connects to the next question that I had, which is, earlier we said that Max's HIV result was negative, but what if it actually had come back positive? Would HIV have an impact on his ongoing refugee claim? And I'm going to talk a little about HIV here because it is an STBBI, and I think it is one that people sometimes have a lot of questions about. So, would an HIV result have an impact on his ongoing refugee claim? So again, I'll say I'm not an immigration lawyer, but I can share information taken from this really good resource. It's from the HIV Legal Network of Canada, and it contains and explains information about the law, but again, it is not legal advice. So the information from this resource about the law is that for a person like Max, who is a refugee claimant, a positive HIV result would not impact his refugee claim. In fact, in our story about Max, he was tested at a clinic because of his symptoms. And so if his result was positive for HIV, he would receive that same support from public health, just like anyone who had a positive chlamydia or positive tuberculosis result. A public health nurse would contact him to find out if he has other sexual partners that need to be tested, and they would find ways to get those people tested without having to let them know that it was because of Max's result. So public health nurses have many different ways of doing this, and in BC, we actually also have an online service that can let partners know that they need to be tested for STBBIs. And again, this is done anonymously, meaning your information is not shared with that person. And this is a resource that I'll share later on in a slide. So in addition, because Max has IFHP coverage, he would also be able to access HIV medication for free. And again, based on the information that I've gathered, in this case, public health would likely not inform the IRB about Max's positive result. They would not inform the IRB. The cases where the IRB is made aware of a person's HIV status is usually if a person tests positive for HIV from the immigration medical exam. So I'll refer to it as the IME, immigration medical exam. The immigration medical exam is also required for a newcomer to Canada who is applying for a specific visa or coming to work at a specific job. And the IME is required for anyone who goes through the process of becoming a refugee claimant. It's an exam that actually includes testing for some STBBIs like syphilis and HIV, and it's an exam that can only be done by a physician who is approved to do immigration medical exams. So from the information from this resource, if a refugee claimant tests positive for HIV on their immigration medical exam, their HIV positive status would not prevent their claim from being accepted. It would not prevent them from successfully applying for permanent residency once their claim is accepted. But where it can affect a newcomer is if a newcomer tests positive for HIV on their immigration medical exam and they are not a refugee claimant. In a case like this, it might have an impact on the immigration process for that person. Because outside of the refugee program, a newcomer might be assessed on how much care their healthcare might cost the Canadian healthcare system in the long term. So again, there's more detailed information about this in this resource, which I'll share, the website link. But if you have a client that's going through a situation like this, again, connect with organizations like Rainbow Refugee, with your local settlement offices, and very possibly an immigration lawyer. And Nazanin, did you want to add more to that?
No, I think this was very comprehensive. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it's okay. I see we are running out of time. So I just want you to meet Iman. Iman is a registered nurse. So this is where I kind of want to talk about more of the healthcare provider perspective and to touch more on the really important topics that Dima brought up earlier, which is how as healthcare providers and service providers, we can be more inclusive, more sex positive, and more culturally safe. So Iman is a registered nurse who, let's say, works with Max. Iman is also a nurse that works with Ilham. So Ilham is a very, young 20-year-old newcomer to Canada. During the pandemic, was working at, kind of a, let's say a pizza parlor kind of place and lost their job because of the pandemic, because of all the closures, and then ended up unemployed, was approached by an older man saying, I can help you with your situation. I need someone to clean my house a few days a week. So she agrees because she has no other sources of income and needs to survive. And while she's there cleaning his house, he says to her, well, if you want to keep this job, you're going to have to do something for me. And so basically tells her that she needs to have sex with him in order to keep having this job. Iman, as a nurse, also works with Carmen. So Carmen is also a newcomer, a person in their 60s, divorced from their previous partner in their home country for many years, but now has a new partner in Canada and is having sex with this person, has a new boyfriend, they're in their 60s, and wants to talk to you about how to make sex better. because in their previous relationship, they didn't get a lot of joy or fulfillment from sex with their previous partner that they're now divorced from, and now wants to explore this part of their life and their sexuality. And so for a person like Carmen or myself or other folks on this call, what are some tips that we can share about trauma-informed care and culturally safe care? So Dima did talk about stigma, and the World Health Organization talks about stigma in the context of health. It's a negative association between a person or a group of people who share certain characteristics or a specific disease. So in reducing stigma, as I mentioned, language is really important. So I'll share with you later. BC CDC actually put it out during the pandemic. It has a funny title. It's called the COVID-19 Language Guide, but it actually has a lot of really good information and new phrases that we can use that are much more respectful towards the people that we are working with. Oh, whoops, sorry. Also, I think it's important as service providers to reflect on your own assumptions. And I think Dima actually made a really strong point earlier about not assuming that the person's home country or country of origin is this place that is so much less developed, and that the services or the service providers there are just so less capable than what we have here. That's definitely not true. I think just like within this country, services and levels and it can vary, and it's the same in other countries. And so we shouldn't have this kind of condescending attitude that, oh, well, I'm sure that this person's never had a cervical screen or has never had or has heard of this kind of testing because they come from this country. Don't assume. And I think the way to reflect on our assumptions and to act better is exactly what Dina said, is to listen to people. So one thing that we can do as service providers is to ask people, what was your experience like in other places with STBBI testing? And I can tell you more about what it'll be like in this visit, and to really start off your visits, especially if you're someone working in sexual health care, not just kind of like the routine way that we kind of do it. People sit down and you're like, oh, what brings you in today? I feel like for refugee and newcomers, we do need to take that time to really listen to people and ask people and let people know that, the what's going to follow in this visit is totally voluntary and it's your choice. And I'm going to explain to you why I'm doing certain things. So I think that's part of another way that we can kind of improve our care and services, and also question what information is truly necessary when taking, let's say, a medical history. So if you are someone working in sexual health care, it's important to really think about when you're asking questions what that can mean. And I'll share some examples. So for instance, uh, I was working with a client who had in the previously had several children, but they were all in the care currently of the ministry. So this person's children was no longer in their care. They were in the care of, let's say, foster parents and foster care. And so, but because when I do cervical screening for people, part of what standard is asking questions about pregnancy history. And so I had just routinely asked, how many pregnancies have you had? How many children are living? And it was very obvious that this was a very painful question for this person that I was asking. And so, and I have to think about that. I thought about it later, like, do I really need to ask that question? Is it actually going to change what I do in this visit? I'm still going to do the cervical screen. So I think as for folks who are working with newcomer and refugee populations and LGBTQI plus populations, we do need to be really mindful about questions that we're asking and if we really need to ask them all. And one strategy that I would say is, now when I ask this question, I always say, I ask everyone this question, but you don't need to answer if you don't want to. So I just kind of sometimes use that blanket in front of certain questions that I ask. Be careful with your curiosity. So another situation that I'll share is I was working with an Indigenous client and I just, was making small talk and I was just being curious. I said, "Oh, like what nation are you from?" And, "Oh, so do you speak that language?" And they looked down and on the floor at their feet and said, "No, I don't speak that language because my parents were in residential school when I was growing up, and we lost the language. And so for many of us, I'm sure we're aware here in Canada that the legacy of colonization and racism still exists, and there's many people among us that have this painful experience of their parents or themselves being displaced and forcibly removed from their homes as children. And so for me, that was a lesson. I need to be careful with my curiosity. We can't just ask questions because, oh, I just want to know and you can answer it, right? Like that's a sign for me. That was a sign for me that like I need to take responsibility of the things that I'm ignorant about so I don't make a mistake like that in the future. Use translation services. So this is something that can be helpful, but at the same time, I have noticed that some newcomers are hesitant to use it because they are sometimes afraid that they might know the translator or that the translator might be someone from their community. And so finally, I will say, be active in anti-racism. And I'm sorry, we're running out of time. So here are some resources that we'll be able to share with you when we share the slides that speak a little bit more to that. And this is a really good resource that I found about trauma-informed care when you're doing STD-BI testing. Thank you, everyone. I'm so sorry we went over time.
Thank you so much, Sherilyn. This was great. Thank you for this amazing information. I also want to commend you on the personal work you did and the time you put in to excel in sharing this. It's so great. Like even if you're a service provider that isn't directly involved with sexual health, it's always good to know these things and how to support in an informed way. Um, I was gonna ask folks to do some self-care and share with us what they're gonna do after this webinar, since it was quite a heavy topic, but we can totally skip that and just everyone, um, please take care of yourself. I'm very glad that you found this webinar helpful. And hopefully we'll see you in next webinars. Thank you very much for your time. We'll send the slide.
Yes, we'll send the slides with the resources. Salamat,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day ahead.
Oh, we forgot to share the poll, Dima. It's okay, we'll share it next time. Oh, Dima left.
Yeah, Dima's gone. Sorry. Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye. Take care.
Take care.
So, bye.